So this is Mike Billington. I'm with the Executive Intelligence Review and the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Organization. I'm speaking here with Dr. Justin Yifu Lin, who was the chief economist and senior vice president at the World Bank from 2008 to 2012, and is now the dean at several institutes at Peking University, the dean of the Institute for New Structural Economics, and the dean at the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development, as well as a professor and honorary dean at the National School of Development. Would you like to add anything to that brief introduction, Dr. Lin?
Well, I think that's sufficient.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Okay, very good. So, as you probably know, I sent you some of this. There are several senior diplomats and intelligence professionals in the United States, including Ambassador Chas Freeman, who has great experience in China, and former CIA official Graham Fuller, who have warned that the US foreign policy has been weaponized and that diplomacy has been lost, and that this is driving the danger of war between the US and China, as well as with Russia. You have argued in the past what could be called economic deterrence, that as China's economy becomes significantly larger than that of the US, that the, as you put it, the United States' own development could then not ignore the opportunities brought by the Chinese market, and that this would bring about a peaceful and common development between China and the United States. What is, in your mind, what is preventing that peaceful and common development now?
Well, thank you very much for this very important questions for our world today. Because first, we need to understand the cooperation between the US and China is crucial for addressing many global challenges, because US is the largest and the most strongest country in the world. And China is the second largest economy in terms of economic size. And their cooperation will be the foundation for addressing like climate change, like to contain the pandemic, and like to help the other country to get rid of the poverty in order to achieve the sustainable development goals by the time of 2030. So the cooperation is important, and cooperation certainly is good for the US and for China and for the whole world. But we did not see the cooperation to come around. And we see a lot of tensions in the recent years. I think it's because of the US lose confidence of herself. US is the largest economy in the world throughout the 20th century. But in terms of purchasing power parity measurement, China overtook US in 2014. And the US, for her own interest, tried to maintain its dominance economically, politically, and so on. And so now there's some strategy in the US to try to contain China. And certainly those kind of strategy reflect in US diplomatic foreign relations policy with China. And certainly that will be threatening the stability of the world, because first, we need to have cooperation to address those kind of global issues. But because of those kind of tension, it threatens the foundation for cooperation. And that will add to the uncertainty of the world, not only without addressing the challenging issue, it adds to the uncertainty of the world. That's very bad. But I think that, how can we improve that? Well, one way is that China reduce the economic size. If China cut off per capita GDP half, then the US will now feel threatened. But it's not possible, because development is the human right. That is in the UN constitutions. And that is a constitution has been advocated by the US and many other advanced countries for centuries. So there's no reason why China need to, cut our incomes by half or even more to please the US. And the other way around, certainly, is to continue to have the development, to have the growth. And I wrote in one article arguing that if China can reach the per capita GDP of half of the US, I think it's very moderate, only half of the US, I think the US will, accept China by that time for 3 reasons. If the per capita GDP in China is half of the US, and certainly we have some kind of internal differences, our more developed regions, like the major cities, Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and the more developed area, our coastal provinces, like the Shandong, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Fujian, and Guangdong, their combined population is a little bit more than 400 million population. Currently, US population is around 340 million, but certainly US population will continue to grow. And I think that those more developed regions in China, their per capita GDP will be about the same as the US per capita GDP. And their economic size will be about the same as the US economic size. But we know per capita GDP means the average labor productivity of that part of the economy. And the average labor productivity certainly is, reflecting the industrial achievement, technological achievement. So by that time, US will not have the technological superiority that they can use to chalk up the Chinese development. Currently, you see the US put a lot of high-tech companies in China on the so-called entity list without actually concrete evidence for their accusation. And that is only because US want to use their technological superiority to chalk up China's development. By the time, if the more advanced region in China had the same income level, it means the same technological level, US will not be able to do that. Yes. Secondly, our population size is about 4 times of the US. If our per capita GDP is half of the US, that means what? China's economic size will be twice as large as the US. No matter how unhappy the US is, US cannot change that fact. It's a fact. And third, China is the largest economy by that time, and China will continue to grow. And for the US, for example, those Fortune 500 companies, if they want to stay on that 500 companies list, they cannot lose Chinese market. And also, trade certainly is win-win, but we know that the smaller economy gains more than the larger economy. By that time, China's economy will be twice as large as the US, and trade with China, US will gain more. So for that, certainly, if US politicians really care about their own people, then to have a friendly relation with China would be necessary for the US to improve the well-being of their own people and to maintain their leadership, their company's leadership in the world.
Right. You actually argued once before that that the US intentionally suppressed the Japanese economy in the 1980s and 90s to, as you said, to prevent them from threatening the US economic status. And that they're, as you've just said, they're doing pretty much the same thing now towards China, having suppressed these Chinese companies with accusations and so forth. How has China countered this today? You've already said what you propose will come in the future. But how can China counter this attack on Huawei and other companies today?
I think the first thing we need to remain open. We need to remain, move our economy to further, improve the market efficiency. I think that because certainly US today has some superiority, upper hand in certain technologies. But US is not the only country to have those kind of technologies. Like advanced country in Europe, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan and Korea, they also have many, advanced technologies. And China should remain open, to access to the technology from other advanced countries, as long as it's not the technology US is the monopoly. And by that way, you know that the advanced technology rely on heavy R&D. It's very expensive. Once they get those kind of technological breakthrough, how profitable for the companies depends on how large the market. And measured by purchasing power parity, China is the largest market in the world already. And China since 2008, every year contributed about 30% to the global market expansion. So as long as China can open Chinese market, I think that other high-tech companies will be very delighted to fill in the gap that due to the US restrict its company to export those kind of technology to China. And China only need to focus on a few technology, which US is the only supplier in the world. And, and by that, we will not be choked off. And secondly, certainly we need to continue to develop our economies so we can go currently, if you measure by purchasing power parity, our per capita GDP is about 25% of the US, and by market exchange rate, now per capita GDP is about 1/6 of the US. And as long as I said that we can maintain the growth momentum, I think the dilemma will be addressed.
So you've written for years about the fact that the advanced industrial nations reached the point they are at today by using government-directed credit and what you call industrial policy to protect and support emerging industries and the research that's necessary for that kind of development. But that now these advanced sector countries are denying the same measures to today's emerging economies under the demand of free trade. The Korean economist Chang Ho-jun called this kicking away the ladder. Lyndon LaRouche has pointed to this as the primary difference between the British system of free trade and the original American system of protection and directed credit. And I have also written that the Chinese economic model today that you promote is closer to the American system with people like Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List and Henry Carey than is now practiced in the US itself. How do you see this?
I fully agree with your questions. Actually, not only US protected her own industry during the catching up stage. Britain practiced the same. Before the 17th century, Britain was on the process to catch up Netherlands, because at that time, Netherlands in the wool textile sectors was more advanced than Britain. And the per capita GDP in Netherlands was about 30% higher than the per capita GDP in Britain. Britain adopted similar strategies to protect its own wool textile industries and create all kind of incentive to smuggle the equipment from Netherlands to the Britain and provide incentive to attract the craftsmen in wool textile sectors in Netherlands to Britain. So exactly the same, like what the Hamilton argues or List argues. And Britain only turned to the free trade after the Industrial Revolution. Britain was the most advanced country in the whole world, and their industry was most advanced in the world. They want to export their product to other countries, so they started to advocate free trade. And at that time, the US wanted to catch up. And so US used exactly the same policy as Britain used in the 17th century when Britain wanted to catch up the Netherlands. And so if you look into history, only a few countries were able to industrialize and to catch up. And you can see in the catching up process, they all use the government active facilitation to support their industrial upgrading and so on. And not only so, actually the advanced country, Britain and the US, even they became the most advanced country. On the one hand, they argue free trade for their industries, but at the same time, they also actively support the research and development to further improve their technology. And so they can, continue to upgrade their technology and also to develop new higher value industries by R&D, because at that time, their technology were on the global frontiers. And if they want to have new technology, they will have to invent the technology by themselves. And the invention of technologies, has two parts. One is basic research. The other one is development of new technology, new product. Firms certainly have incentive to develop new technology and new products, because if they are successful, they can get a patents. And then they can have a monopoly for up to 17 or 20 years in the global market. But at the same time, if they do not have better basic research, then it would be very difficult or even impossible for them to have the development of new product and new technologies. But the basic research, the result, the finding is a public good. And so the private sectors do not have the incentive to do basic research. And so if you look into the high-income country, they all support the basic research. And that is a necessity for them to continue to have a new stream of technology, new stream of products, and so on. So exactly, they are still doing the industrial policy. But the difference is that they are on the global frontiers. And so the type of industrial policy to address market values will be different from the type of industrial policy to address the market values in a developing country. So in nature, it's the same. But actually, the areas that the government required to put the effort will be different. So recently, there's a very famous book called The Entrepreneurial State by Mazzucato. And he documents all the major competitive industry in the US today were the result of the government active support in the basic research in the previous decade. So exactly the same. So just the area that a country require the government to put an effort will be different, depends on the state of development. And you know that in the US, there are two traditions. One tradition is Hamilton tradition, to argue the government should provide support to overcome the barrier for further development. And the other tradition is, Jefferson tradition, to say the government should do nothing. We should, adopt a market function. The government should be minimal. But in fact, in the practice, in the US, since the founding of the nation has been following Hamilton, but rhetorically following the Jefferson tradition. And so you have a split between the reality and your rhetoric. But unfortunately, your rhetoric has been so powerful. And so all the developing countries, they are advised not to do anything by their government. And as a result, except for a few countries, their government follow the Hamilton tradition and to be able to industrialize and catch up. And other countries, they were misguided by the Jefferson tradition without doing anything. And so they were unable to narrow the gap with the advanced country.
Yes, exactly. So you and other Chinese officials, including Premier Li Keqiang, have called for a new means of accounting the strength of nations, arguing that looking only at the GDP and the debt, which are the money side, is what you called severely flawed for considering only monetary data and leaving out the underlying national assets, including human capital, natural capital, and produced capital. You call this alternative method wealth accounting. So how far has this idea been developed and put in use in China or anywhere else?
I'm delighted to see an increasing recognition for the national, to change in the national accounting. Because GDP is a flow contract, how much you produce every year. But the production every year depends on the stock of the wealth, including the human capital, natural resources, biodiversity, and as well as the produced capitals, the equipment, the machinery, the equipment, and also the infrastructure. All those are the wealth of the nation and the foundation for producing goods and service to generate the GDP. But in the past, we only look at the flow concept, the GDP, without paying condition to the foundation to generate the flow. And the foundation should be based on the wealth, the asset we just described. And I'm delighted to see now increasingly there was a recognition of a necessity to change the concept, including like IMF recently produced a paper to say, if the government use the debt to finance the investment in infrastructure, it generates assets. And it will be different from the government use debt to finance consumption, and those are pure debt. And so if we calculate net debt, if the government use the debt to support the infrastructure or other improvement in human capital and so on, then it will contribute to the ability for the nation to generate new stream of income, and they will enhance the ability to pay back debt. But in the past, when we talk about the debt sustainability framework, that framework only calculate the gross debt without paying to the asset side. And the IMF today call for revise in its debt sustainability framework. So we are delighted to see now this new, this more inclusive concept has been increasingly recognized and put into the policy evaluation.
Were you and other Chinese economists involved in that change at the IMF?
I think that when I was at the World Bank, I started to advocate that. I wrote policy notes to advocate that. And but to change people's belief or people's ways of behaving certainly takes time. And so I was the chief economist of World Bank from 2008 and 12. And the IMF change is proposed to change the new framework only after about 4 years after I left. And so I think that if we want to change the world, conversation like you and me, and people with better concept of the idea should should not stop advocating that, and that more people understand. And then I think that gradually and at the end, I'm sure the world will change for better.
Yes, I was going to ask anyway that you are attacking the neoliberal orthodoxy, But while you were at the World Bank between 2008 and 2012, you were face to face with that as the dominant ideology at the World Bank and the IMF. So I guess you're explaining now how you dealt with it then and how it's having a longer term effect of your arguments. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's very true. For example, when I first arrived at the World Bank, I started to say, to advocate structural transformation is the foundation for, inclusive and sustainable development in any country. But if you look into the infrastructure, the structural transformations, there are so many market values there, because you not only need to rely on the entrepreneur, to have the innovations, but entrepreneurs, if they want to be successful, you need to provide adequate infrastructure, you need to provide adequate financial support, and so you need to have improvement in infrastructure, improvement in the financial, structure, institution, and so on. Certainly also legal institution. And for all those things, the individual enterprises, they will not be able to deal with.
Right.
You need to require the state to do it. But state's capacity and resources are limited. And so you need to use your limited capacity and resources strategically. And then that means you need to pick certain area that you want to do and so on. And those certainly is so-called industrial policy. At the beginning, industrial policy was a taboo in international development organizations, including World Bank. But I started to advocate that. I'm delighted to see increasingly now people accept it's necessary to have industrial policy, including the US government now openly say, we embrace industrial policy for our further development, right? And for example, infrastructure. In 2009, I started to advocate to invest in infrastructure on the one hand, to cope with the counter-cyclical intervention, the necessity for counter-cyclical intervention, but at the same time to pay the foundation for long-term development in the developing world. So it's a major one stone killing two birds. At the beginning, people were also very reluctant. At that time, the counter-cyclical intervention mostly are in providing a rescue package to lay off workers and so on. And I see certainly to stabilize the economy will be essential. But if you only provide, let's say, the unemployment benefit, you support the consumption, yes, but you do not contribute to enhancing the growth potential in the future. And if you invest in infrastructure, you will create jobs. So you reduce the need for unemployment benefit, but at the same time you pay the foundation for the long-term growth. I think at the beginning people were very reluctant, but I'm delighted to see now both the World Bank, the IMF, and European Union, and to some extent also the US accept the idea, started to advocate the need for infrastructure. So recently, the Biden administration proposed to the Congress for fund to support the infrastructure investment. So those kind of ideas, when I was the World Bank, when I started to argue for that, they were so foreign to many people. They think, well, if infrastructure is an investment, market will take care of that. But what we see, the market could not do it. And so we need to have an active government participation. And I'm delighted to see, gradually, people started to embrace many ideas. I started to advocate at the World Bank and put into their programs.
On the other hand, the US and Europe are continuing to deal with their huge debt crisis by simply printing money, the quantitative easing, sure, and other problems. So while they're acknowledging the huge deficit in infrastructure, and they're making some small efforts in that direction, they're continuing with the QE, which is threatening a hyperinflation today, which I think even the inside gurus of Wall Street and the City of London are acknowledging that there's a grave, grave danger of a hyperinflation. What is your view on that?
Yeah, I think that, to change the ideas will be essential for changing their policy orientations. For this, I agree with Keynes. In the last sentence of his general theory, he said, it is ideas, not vested interest, which are dangerous for good or evil. And in the past, the world was influenced by those kind of inappropriate neoliberalism. And so the government policy was shaped by those kind of misguided ideas. And so that's very important for your institute and for scholars like me to advocate, present alternative ideas which can address the issue and also improve our well-being in individual country and also in the world. And I think that certainly at the end, people see the benefit and they will start to make some changes. At the beginning, maybe a very small step, but once they see the power of the right interventions, the power of the right policy, I think that the world will, only by the way the world will move for better. And I do wish the right idea will win the debate at the end.
When I looked at your idea of wealth accounting, going beyond the monetary figures of GDP and debt, I thought about Lyndon LaRouche's idea of a non-monetary measure of economic progress, which he called relative potential population density. His view was that these were ratios determined by the transformation of the physical economies through the rates of development of new physical principles, discovered in nature and then applied to the productive process through new machine tools using those new principles. Do you see that as similar to your idea of wealth management? I
think that idea is very close to the idea that we just described, or I have been advocating for a long time. And we do see, we share some wisdom, and our ideas, our proposals converge on the same directions. Mm-hmm. And so we need to, join hands to propose the right ideas, through your institute and my institute, and to outreach it to more people.
Good. You recently wrote an article with your associate, Dr. Yan Wang, who has also spoken at one of our Schiller Institute conferences, comparing the approach of the IMF and the World Bank to the development of Africa to that of the Chinese approach using your wealth accounting idea. And you said in that article that that despite many decades of aid from the West, it did not address the infrastructure bottlenecks, and that this was the primary reason that the African countries very much appreciate Chinese investment, which emphasizes infrastructure as the means to lift the productivity of the entire nation and escape from poverty. So as you know, the Schiller Institute and EIR have strongly promoted the idea of the new Silk Road since the 1990s, actually, following the fall of the Soviet Union, and as a means of achieving peace through development. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative launched by President Xi Jinping is very much in the light. How would you evaluate so far the progress of the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa and elsewhere?
First, I'm delighted to see that this new ideas has been welcomed and also joined hands in the practice. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative currently already 145 countries signed the strategic cooperation agreement with China. And also more than 30 international organizations signed the strategic cooperation agreement with China. So I am delighted to see this idea has been widely accepted in the world. And China also continued to support the infrastructure and upgrading infrastructure improvement in the world in spite of the pandemic recessions. And those kind of investments certainly provide the foundations to, for the future, but at the same time, improve the job and economic development even during these pandemic times. And I'm also delighted to see the European country now propose a similar strategy like European Gateway, and as a way to improve the infrastructure to link to other countries. So I think the world is moving towards the same directions, and certainly the infrastructure gap is so huge. No one country can accomplish, all what is needed. So it will be desirable to join hands with all initiatives by China, by European country, by Japan, by the US, because fundamentally we care about the humanity. We care about the future of the earth, the future of your human being. And as long as we contribute to that, we should join hands. And we should not take the individual country political purpose, and to that become a barrier for our corporations.
Yes, in that same article about the African development, you directly blamed the IMF and the World Bank for what you called neoliberal orthodoxy. And you said that the result of that was that many low and middle income countries continue to suffer from fundamental deficiencies, such as the lack of healthcare personnel and resources. And you even noted that 70 years of development aid, and yet still, quote, there is the inability to deliver clean water, electricity, and sanitation. So as you know, the Schiller Institute president, Helga Zeppler-Rusch, has formed what she calls the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, which is based on an idea of the 15th century genius Nicholas of Cusa, calling for a global mobilization to address the health crisis that you've identified, to provide a modern health system in every country, if the pandemic and future pandemics are going to be defeated. I know that part of what China has launched is a health Silk Road. So what are your thoughts on global cooperation to achieve this kind of health system in every country?
I think that there's a need, and a huge need there. And this pandemic showed that. And China certainly, contribute to that. You mentioned about health Silk Road. And you also understand China already provided 2 billion doses of vaccine to Africa and other parts of the world. And that's more than 1/3 of the dose of vaccine in the world, excluding China. So I think but that's not needed. That's not sufficient. So we need to work harder, to work together. Otherwise, the COVID-19 pandemic may lingering, and as the longer the pandemic is there, the harder to deal with, because there are going to be other new mutations coming out all the time, make the vaccine becomes less effective. So we need to join hand to contend at the sooner the better. And we also need to establish the foundation to cope with similar challenge in the future, when this kind of threatening violence appear. At the beginning, we should cope with that. We should replace that immediately. And for that, we need to have global corporations. So I think the call is very important, and we should join hands to promote that.
Good. Let me bring up the horrible situation in Afghanistan, where, as you know, 40 years of war and now the freezing of that nation's very scarce reserves by the US Federal Reserve and several European banks, and the imposition of sanctions, and even cutting off the aid from the IMF and the World Bank, which has created a threat of what has to be recognized as genocide through starvation and disease in that country. In particular, the World Bank was supporting the nation's healthcare system for the last 20 years of the US NATO warfare and occupation there. And that's been completely cut off, leaving the country with virtually no public health system at all. And in this case, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has launched another project. She calls it Project Ibn Sina, named after the 11th century medical genius, Persian, who came from that region, though, of Afghanistan, and who, and our proposal is demanding a release of these funds, not just emergency aid, but the release of these funds, but also to build the nation's infrastructure, as you've been emphasizing, by integrating Afghanistan into the Belt and Road, and in particular, extending the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC, into Afghanistan. Do you think this is possible?
I think it's possible if we really care about humanity. I think that the support in the healthcare, in the medical situation, should be unconditional. You know, and if you accept that ideas, certainly well-meaning health and so on in Afghanistan and other developing countries will be improved. Once they have the improvement in their health, improvement in the economic development, and then the social political stability there can be maintained. And I'm sure that it's not only good for the individual country, it's also good for the global communities, because then we will be in a better situation to work together and to have more cooperations. And it will also reduce the refugee legally and illegally to the high-income country. Yeah. And that will also be a big challenge for the high-income country. So in some area, the support should be unconditional, because that relates to the humanity. If they really care about human beings, then no matter under what kind of situation, we should support some kind of those basic needs.
Right. As you know, the U.S. and China signed a phase 1 agreement in January of 2020, a trade agreement between the Trump administration and China. And at the White House, Liu He was there in attendance, and President Xi Jinping was on the telephone with President Trump. And Trump at that time announced that he would soon make a second visit to China. And he said he looked forward to what he called, in his words, continuing to forge a future of greater harmony, prosperity, and commerce, which would lead to an even stronger world peace. Now, clearly, this never happened. As the US failed to contain the COVID-19 pandemic, Trump eventually fell into adopting the antagonistic approach to China from his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, blaming China for virtually every failure in the United States. And although the current Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has the same hostile attitude towards China, President Biden has had several long calls with President Xi. Do you see some chance of restoring that, quote, greater harmony coming out of this cooperation between Biden and President Xi?
I think that China's door is always open. And as we said at the beginning, cooperation between China and the US will pay the foundation to address many of the global challenges that we encounter today. So it will be essential. And China's door is open, but why it did not occur? I think it's because certainly there are some problems in the US. And US, if you look into the past, US always like to use other country as the scapegoat for its own domestic problems. And certainly that may gain some kind of political interest for the politician in the short run, but it will make the issue become worse for the long term. So I hope the politicians and the intellectuals communities in the US will have the wisdom to understand what are the roots of its own problems. And it should not use the other country as the excuse or scapegoat for its own problems. The short-term political gain is for a few politicians, but at the cost of the well-being of the whole nations. And I hope that this kind of situation will be improved. And if those foundations, if those kind of using other country as scapegoat for its own domestic problem is removed, then certainly US and China cooperation will be good for the US, for China, and for the world.
I want to also bring up something that Lyndon LaRouche very much focused on in his own work, which was that the quality of creativity which distinguishes man from the beast is the same in scientific investigations as it is in artistic discoveries, especially that of classical music. And in that light, that he insisted that scientific education and aesthetic education must go hand in hand in order to allow the full development of the creative powers of our youth and our population. We have definitely taken, I personally have very much taken note of the fact that there is a new appreciation in China following the dark days of the Cultural Revolution to honor the classical traditions in China of Confucius and Mencius and the great minds of the Song Renaissance dynasty, people like Zhu Xi and Shen Guo, and that this is going on simultaneous with the incredible economic and scientific developments taking place in China, as well as China's increased acknowledgement of the great cultural development in Western culture and Western classical music and so forth. So how do you see the relationship between economics and science and the aesthetic side of cultural development?
I see the science and art, and they are complementary to each other, and they both enrich our human being and unleash our potentials. And so we should not just focus on one thing and then neglect the others. And if we want to have a better society, and we also want to have, allow the people to develop them, themselves with the greater potentials. And so, as you described, and you notice, China now, is trying to bring in our traditional cultural appreciation of the art, music, classic, not only from China, but from other civilizations back to our programs, educational programs. So that's a good sign. And I'm sure that will further make the rejuvenation of China to reach a higher stage, not only materially, but culturally, spiritually.
Well, okay, thank you. Is there any other thoughts you'd like to convey to the LaRouche organization supporters?
I'm delighted to have this opportunity, and I hope our voice will be heard in more corners in the world. And because fundamentally, we all care about human beings, and we all want to have a better society for every country in the world. And so that's, hope our message will get momentum, traction in the world.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your taking the time. I hope that we can, in fact, build on this cooperation. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has always insisted that if we are going to bring about a new paradigm for mankind, it's going to mean that each culture reach back to its greatest moments and that we work together to bring about a truly human renaissance rather than just a European Renaissance and a Chinese Renaissance or an Islamic Renaissance, but that we bring mankind together to address the common humanity that is the one basis on which we can end this descent into conflict and war and depression.
Very good. Thank you very much.
And thank you.